Welcome back, everyone. This is our fourth and last panel. Our expert panel is our last expert panel is going to be on governing the impacts of generative AI across sectors and domains. And particularly, we are going to focus on education, healthcare, and labor. To moderate this conversation, I would like to introduce my dear colleague and collaborator, Jodi Forlizzi. Jodi is the Herbert Simon Professor in Computer Science and HCII. She is responsible for establishing design research as a legitimate form of research in HCI, and that is different but equally as important as scientific and human science research. Jodi studies the ethical impacts of human interaction with AI systems in frontline service industries, including healthcare and hospitality. She also studies the potential for AI to facilitate purposeful employment for people with disabilities. Jodi has received the ACM Lifetime Research Award. Please help me in welcoming Jodi to the podium.
Thank you, Hoda. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final panel of this wonderful conference. I'll just describe the structure. We have three speakers who will be making remarks. We'll have everybody seated at the front. We'll have some conversation. And as always, you can submit questions on Slido, and we will take some questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'll invite our first speaker up to the podium. Sarah Fox is an assistant professor in the HCI Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, where she directs the Tech Solidarity Lab. Her work examines the impacts of AI and automation on essential work sectors with a focus on developing systems that center workers' needs and expertise. And Sarah has a PhD in human-centered design and engineering from the University of Washington. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Jodi and Hoda. So like Jodi mentioned, I'm faculty in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, where I have the pleasure of directing a lab called the Tech Solidarity Lab. And today I'll briefly describe work that we've done to understand the deployment of AI within essential sectors and how that reshapes existing work practices with a focus on developing systems that center workers' needs and expertise. Within this research, I'll just click forward. We focus on a particular question that I think is deceptively simple. So that is, how can workers' perspectives be made central in technology development and deployment? And to give you a sense of how we're going about responding to that question, I'll briefly talk about two recent projects that I have done with collaborators, including the brilliant Jodi Forlizzi right here, in the space of worker-centered design. So the first case I'll describe is the redesign of a technology already pervasive across the hospitality industry. So I'll go into detail about that now. So this is a partnership with Unite Here, the largest hospitality workers union in the United States. And along with Jodi and other colleagues in labor relations, economics, and hospitality management, we have spent the past couple of years examining how AI is transforming the industry. So our work has thus far engaged with housekeepers and managers to understand the effects of algorithmic management on their roles, workflow, and collaboration. And just to give you a sense of what this technology does, algorithmic management tools are widely deployed, like I mentioned, and they're used to coordinate housekeeping service. So they might order room cleaning assignments, mediate digital communications between frontline workers and their supervisors and managers, and allocate tasks across departments, so from housekeeping to maintenance to front desk, etc. And one of the first things that we learned from workers was that the way that they were asked to complete tasks, to complete room assignment tasks in particular, had become more difficult with the onset of algorithmic management. So traditionally, they may have cleaned a section of a floor all in a row, so maybe the east end of the 10th floor or something like this. But a simple visualization of a housekeeper's personal work log reveals just how much additional travel she's taking on as a result of the system's assignments. So notably, she's carrying with her up and down hallways and stairs, something like a 300 or 400 pound cart full of supplies. So you can begin to see how these kind of algorithmic decisions that we think of as kind of as not so physical or things like this have real physical ramifications on workers. And this is already, as you can, I'm sure, imagine, a really labor-intensive job with high rates of acute injury and other kinds of hazards. So this effectively means a kind of an intensification of work for them. So drawing from these initial insights, we collaborated with Union on worker-centered design investigations in the form of workshops and later collaborative prototyping sessions that were meant to build and discuss alternatives through prototypes that reflected their desire for self-efficacy, transparency, and a more balanced workload. And critically, every housekeeper we engaged with through this initial work talked about the tensions between workflow and the control of algorithmic management. So in this particular prototype that it kind of responds to some of these concerns, you can see a room list which allows a housekeeper to choose what assignments to do next by dragging them to the top of the list. This is what we term a kind of self-sequencing feature, which would allow flexibility for housekeepers to take care of unexpected issues, clean in an order that made sense to them, and essentially recognize them as experts in their own work, so knowing how and when to get it done. And of course, this is not meant to be a kind of techno fix or kind of a repair to an existing system. Instead, our aim with this work is to pair these design interventions with other kinds of corresponding policy or bargaining materials to be taken up by the union. And it aligns with organizing efforts that Unite Here has taken up in local unions in San Francisco and other regions. So they're kind of solidifying and making more permanent these kinds of kind of forms of autonomy made and reflected through the technology. And I'll say that this work, I think, has key lessons for other kinds of service industries. For example, in quick service, similar sorts of scheduling and task assignment technologies are being explored. So, for example, McDonald's recently, just the other day, announced a similar sort of kind of GenAI-powered scheduling system. And so this work has clear lessons for those kind of industries as they're deployed very widely to franchisees and others. So the second project I'll briefly feature today is a research collaboration with the Transport Workers Union, the Amalgamated Transit Union, and the AFL-CIO Technology Institute, which is a federation of unions in the United States. And it's centered on the idea that transit operators should have a seat at the table when discussions are being made or decisions are being made about the design and implementation of autonomous vehicle technologies within their industry. So just to give you a sense of the progression of this, public transit has seen a recent uptick of investment of autonomous vehicle technology. So while automation has a potential to alleviate certain challenges with driving tasks, operating transit is more complex than passenger vehicles. So buses are obviously significantly larger, 40 to 60 foot, right? And they operate in highly variable environments alongside pedestrians, vulnerable road users, and so on and so forth. And although it seems kind of counterintuitive, increased automation can actually make the tasks of operating a vehicle like this more challenging. So as automation takes over some of the more routine aspects of driving, operators are left with the most challenging situations. So it's critical in this case that we consider operators' current roles and how work may be impacted by the proposed technological changes being pitched and explored. So drawing on interviews and a longitudinal diary study that kind of spanned a year in length with operators across the US and Canada, we gained a deep understanding of unpredictable roadway behavior and passenger needs that operators manage today. That would effectively confound the capabilities of AV technologies on the market. So operators regularly describe managing onboard situations such as assaults or medical situations where they acted as first responders. And they also managed on-road situations quite difficult, whether it be kind of adverse weather conditions or road work or special events. These kinds of anomalies are actually quite common and, again, would kind of confound the routine driving tasks that are most automatable. So rather than replacing workers outright, we expect automation in these instances to gradually transform the driving role of bus operators. And if not well designed, this could lead to punctuated moments of intense engagement, increased cognitive burdens for operators or attendants on board. And of course, with any data-driven technology, there is the risk of surveillance and heightened managerial control that should be attended to early and often. So following calls from actually the workers we spoke with, there was a desire for a return to the front lines. So our ongoing research in this space is using participatory methods to develop advanced driver assistance technology specifically designed for the transit context. So focusing on the particular safety concerns that operators encounter, again, with pedestrians and vulnerable road users, and using a kind of human-machine teaming approach that is quite inspired by the aviation industry. So the work here is focused on advancing and elevating worker voice early and often in this kind of particularly emergent space of AV and public transit. So collectively, this work is interested in emphasizing the well-being and input of workers, aiming to enhance not only productivity, but also cooperation, autonomy, and fulfillment. So pride in a job well done that we all enjoy. So together, this work seeks to move the idea of shared prosperity forward such that frontline workers too can reap the benefits of technological change now and into the future. With that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next speaker is Marsha Lovett, who serves as the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning Innovation at Carnegie Mellon University, and she is also a teaching professor in the Department of Psychology and a co-coordinator of the Simon Initiative. She oversees the Eberly Center for Teaching Excellence and Educational Innovation, the Core Competencies Initiative, and CMU Online, and she has developed educational technologies to promote student learning and metacognition. Welcome, Marsha.
Thank you, Jodi. Thank you, Hoda, and other organizers, and greetings, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. As Jodi mentioned, my role at Carnegie Mellon, primary role, is supporting the university's educational enhancement through innovative and data-informed uses of technology and effective pedagogies. So what I wanted to talk about today was not just governing the impacts of generative AI in education, but first and foremost, studying them. My main point of view on this issue, as a learning scientist with my home in the psychology department, is to remind ourselves that generative AI's impact on education is ultimately an open empirical question, especially now in these early days. There's not an automatic positive nor an automatic negative when we introduce this technology into teaching and learning scenarios. So what that means in my role of trying to promote effective educational innovation is that before we can productively govern AI's impacts in education, we need to understand them. And so with that in mind, I wanted to tell a little bit about how we are measuring generative AI's impacts at CMU with an initiative that we fondly call GATOR, short for Generative AI Teaching as Research. The idea here is to start by providing support to CMU faculty for and lowering the barriers to innovation with AI across many teaching contexts. That started very early on in providing education and resources about these tools and also support to implement innovations. Beyond that, though, the critical step that we're doing in partnership with faculty teaching courses, live courses at CMU, is to collect rigorous data on targeted student outcomes when they are introducing AI interventions into their courses. Then, after studying the results of those interventions and drawing some insights and conclusions, we want to support the dissemination of transferable evidence-based strategies. It is still early days, but here at CMU, we're really excited to be moving this forward, and I'll come back to this toward the end of my remarks to give you a few examples. Outside of CMU, there is, I think, a good agreement with this idea that research is needed in order to understand the impacts of generative AI in education. Both UNESCO's recent-ish report and the Department of Education's report, you can see there some quotes, are encouraging us to first have processes and practices for understanding how generative AI can have those impacts before we know the best practices to engage in this field. So if our goal is to think about how we can study the impacts of AI in teaching and learning, we need to start by thinking about how it can help, what do we already know about how it can help, and how perhaps it can go wrong. So starting with the challenges, I have here listed student challenges, educator challenges, and then more general challenges that apply to both of those stakeholders. In terms of the challenges that students or learners face, one of the key things that was a focus early on was academic integrity violations when students, intentionally or not, submit students' work that is not necessarily their own, that has been completed with unauthorized assistance of an AI tool, or submitting work from a tool that is not properly cited and acknowledged. This is a piece of the challenge, but I think now that that initial reaction has promulgated throughout education, some of the deeper issues of the challenges for learners are coming to the fore. One, that if learners are using AI in their studies, we want to make sure that the pitfall that we can avoid is that they're using it as a substitute rather than a support for their learning, and that it might, as a consequence, undermine incentives for struggle, focus, and perseverance. When we know from learning science research that learning is hard and what are called desirable difficulties actually contribute to deep and long-standing learning outcomes. On the educator side, again, academic integrity violations have been an early focus. Faculty thinking about policies to police, ban, or control students' use of these technologies. And I also just want to highlight an even bigger challenge is with AI detectors, where the goal is to identify when students may be using these tools, but at present these tools are subject to bias and, in fact, inequities in the false positives of detecting academic integrity violations. Here again, I think the deeper concern is about how we as educators can think about the curricula, basically what it is we're teaching in the face of AI, as well as how we're teaching, and you can see some of those issues there. There are positive opportunities as well that we want to promote and seek to bake into our AI interventions in education. Hopefully, and I appreciate that Jim mentioned this up front, we are seeing some positive improved learning outcomes from using AI in education. One pathway to that that we can try to leverage is by offloading some of the cognitive challenges that are not intrinsic to the learning material, but are just part of the task of doing some studies in a particular field. On the educator side, the opportunities for more efficiency in course design, in grading, and even enabling more differentiated instruction are really exciting possibilities for us to think about. So a few examples here at Carnegie Mellon that you can see on the screen are, in one case, looking at writing instruction where across around 20 or more different courses, we're studying the same basic intervention to see how students learn and perform after they have a bit of feedback either from an AI tool, from a peer, or from their instructor. And what I really like about this work, besides the fact that it's occurring across multiple course contexts, so we can try to uplift general patterns in this intervention's impact, is that the goal then is to see how this approach of the intervention affects students' subsequent writing, drafting, and revision processes. The second study here is on the impacts of generative AI on students' development of critical analysis skills. We have other examples, and one of the final ones that I'll share is actually studying a module that some folks in the room contributed to developing, including Hoda, where the idea is to help teach our students about how these tools work, what's underneath the hood, so that our students themselves can be empowered to make better, more effective, and more responsible decisions around the use of AI. What this means, I think, in terms of guidance for educators is at the foundation, we want to make sure that we and our colleagues are aware of these technologies' capabilities and limitations. That is the first step in order to identify possible applications that align with the teaching and learning goals of the current context, bearing those limitations and opportunities in mind. And as we do so, enacting strategies to mitigate the risks that might be involved. One hopeful strategy is always thinking about how we can maintain a human in the loop. As those interventions are contemplated, the idea of studying the impacts along the lines I've talked about, with or without the support of my colleagues, is truly important so that we can collect rich data on what are the key student behaviors and outcomes we can expect with these technologies in order to promote the best ones. In terms of long-term thinking, I really hope that with these studies as part of our standard practices in higher education, that we can be experimenting with more and more novel use cases and even considering changes at the systems level in terms of the degree programs we're offering, the approaches to education, and offering greater opportunity for students' access and equitable outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Marsha. Our third speaker will be Dr. Shiv Rao, who's the founder and CEO of Abridge, which is live across over 100 health systems and was named as a top 50 AI company by Forbes. Shiv was also recently named as one of the 100 most influential people in AI by Time magazine. Shiv is a practicing cardiologist at UPMC and previously did his undergrad at Carnegie Mellon, where he programmed virtual synthesizers and skateboarded in IMAX movies. Welcome.
Thank you, Jodi and Hoda. It's a privilege to be here. I have the opportunity today to kind of go into one specific industry, one specific vertical, healthcare, and sort of unpack what we've learned over these last few years, how the industry is prioritizing use cases for AI, for generative AI, how the industry is then measuring, and then how the industry we've seen over these last few years has been sort of managing those solutions, how it's been potentially pivoting into new spaces or persevering with what's working. With that in mind, I can kind of get kickstarted. It's an incredible honor to be here. In many ways, Abridge came out of Carnegie Mellon. Our chief technology officer is a professor here, Zach Lipton, but I used to go to Carnegie Mellon as an undergrad, and I remember years ago when we first started the company, a big part of our thesis came some months after transformers were really taking over so many research labs as experiments. Here in the machine learning department, that like, hey, what could we do with transformers? And so we started our work with pre-trained models like BERT and Firebird and Longformer and then Pegasus. And certainly as LLMs started to take over the world, we adopted them as well. But so much of where we are, we owe to those incredible insights that we were able to glean from our colleagues here. These last few years, from an industry, from a business perspective, have been, incredibly, I might even say historic, in the way that healthcare as an industry has taken up and absorbed AI faster than any other industry out there. It's pretty wild because a little bit about me, I used to be a corporate VC at UPMC investing into startups, and I remember being in a room, if a company had 5 or 6 health system logos in a year, it'd be high fives all around, like bottles of champagne, amazing. And healthcare is a gruel. You have to learn how to eat and digest glass from a business perspective, because things can, for the right reasons, oftentimes move very slowly. But I would argue, for the right reasons, things are moving very, very quickly right now in healthcare with AI. And one of the reasons is that you can't swing a stick and not hit a huge problem, a huge opportunity space, and probably a huge opportunity space where there's a job to be done in part by AI. So we've scaled across the country, and I think a big part is the why. It's less about maybe the how. That's a big reason why things are working, but our why relates to burnout. And so maybe in these next few slides, I'll break down a little bit about us and like what's helped us. But I'd love to move a couple layers up very quickly to patterns that we're seeing in the market related to not just us, but any solution, and maybe that could be useful fodder for the panel discussion that we're going to have as well. So big part of our why is that 2 out of 3 doctors don't want to be doctors in the next 2 to 3 years. And 27% of nurses per JAMA, the Journal American Medical Association, don't want to be nurses in the next 12 months. And so rural health systems are shutting down. Patients are having to drive 5, 6 hours to see the inner city rheumatologist who could potentially save a life with this new biologic. And we have a public health emergency because of it. A lot of this is because on the other side of the pandemic, we sort of stretched the rubber band of what's possible, of bandwidth on the provider side so far that things started to really snap. And so health system executives across the country at the C level are sort of realizing that they've got to do something about this problem immediately. And I'd say user experience and burden and burnout has become like a top level priority that obviously has created a big inflection point and opportunity space for us at Abridge. One other point that I'll make is that there's this phenomenon that doctors talk about called pajama time. And what it means is that you have your clinic, you see patients, and then later that day you're spending 2-3 hours sort of writing all your notes, doing all that clerical work. And so that's what we're focused on, taking off people's plates. But certainly what we're also focused on is sort of targeting and serving a specific segment of healthcare where measurement is so important, where responsible AI is a real thing, where there are governance committees already in place oftentimes, where there are ethicists potentially consulting, where there's a lot more, I would say, overhead and maybe the right kind of friction in place in order to sort of deliver, because usually you're delivering at scale. We don't serve small provider groups or individual doctors, but when we serve a system that has tens of thousands of clinicians, doctors, and nurses inside of it across all the different settings, outpatient, inpatient, urgent care, emergency rooms, there's a lot more stakes. The stakes are much higher, and so we need to make sure that we have what it takes to serve those systems, where it's also about security and compliance and reliability. And ultimately, as we'll get to, I'm sure it's about trust. Now, with these last couple minutes, maybe what I'll just break down is what these patterns that we've been seeing. So first, 2 by 2, we've seen 3 steps that people are making as they figure out where to target AI, where to point this like incredible superpower tool that we all have at our disposal now, and we can build on top of. And on this y-axis, where there's a frequency of this workflow, on the x-axis, where the stakes are low, is essentially where we're seeing companies start to really inflect, where we're seeing health systems start to innovate. The high risk side is a little bit more capital R, lowercase d still, but I imagine that will change over the next 3 to 5 years. I don't know if everyone saw, there was a congressperson, I think, or someone had passed a bill trying to push forward an idea of a credentialed AI doctor. who can actually prescribe medications in this country now. I'm sure that will meet a lot of headwinds, but who knows? We'll see. And so I think still for us on the enterprise healthcare system side of this 2x2, it's the low risk that we're focused on. The second step that we've seen health systems sort of take on, like the industries sort of take on in terms of their three-step processes, like where do they build and where do they buy, where do they partner? And here on the y-axis, it's really important, there's a little bit of detail here, is it worth trying to be perfect, and is it impossible to actually be perfect? And maybe this is like really two by twos that I should have unpacked here. And then on the right is, does data make you less imperfect? And that sweet spot for a company like ours, where we know we can invest hundreds of millions of dollars over these next few years even into R&D, is in that space where it's worth trying to be less imperfect. Where health systems actually want that, and where Jivan's paradox is a real thing, where like the more you can hit a model, the better. And so in healthcare, it's an incredible vertical opportunity where we will absolutely cram as much as we possibly can into a pipeline in order to create even like a slightly better output, because it'll be worth it, because the stakes are as high as they are, and because the space that we're in touches so many different stakeholders. So if that's the second step, I think the third step is like measurement, and I'm sure that'll come up over the course of this conversation, is like, how do you measure? How do you stay intellectually honest, all of us as entities within the system? For us, what it's meaned is using validated instruments to measure burden and burnout. We can demonstrate a 60% reduction in cognitive burden within 6 weeks of using the solution. We can save people 2 to 3 hours a day sometimes. And so, hopefully the proof is in the pudding, but certainly there is a long way to go. I think this is my last slide, but I think the most important point actually is that all the measurements we do and all the trust that we can build with an end user as much as with a stakeholder, at the end of the day, it's less about the technology in a way as a solution, as an application layer company. Our real benchmarks are trust. And we think trust is some combination of reliability, transparency, and credibility. And so what we try to do across our stack is unpack how we can be better across all three of those different axes. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks everyone for your insightful comments. We have a lot to discuss. I want to remind the audience to please submit your questions using the QR code on the screen on Slido. And I will start with a general question that anybody could chip in on and answer. How has generative AI disrupted your sector or domain, adoption, innovations, and challenges?
Yeah, happy to go first. I think it's been it's completely changed the complexion for healthcare delivery. There's no question about it. So healthcare, there's multiple different entities, as many most probably understand. There's providers, that's like healthcare delivery systems. There's payers, that's like insurance companies, and then there's life sciences or pharmaceutical companies. Those are three large ones. And every single one of those entities is figuring out how to embrace generative AI. Where I focus my time is really on the provider side. And I think when we've got challenges like the public health emergency I was speaking to, then certainly folks are trying to figure out how can we responsibly deploy technologies that can assist, that can augment, and that can automate. And what we're seeing, a lot of automation where that's happening is back office, where the stakes are a little bit lower. And I think we spoke to human in the loop sort of technology, like variants, user experiences, and that's where we kind of are. We have like the clinician is always in the loop, trusting and verifying every single sort of decision or inference that the models have like come up with. And that's what we think is the only way to go on the provider-facing point-of-care side of things. But on the payer side, there's been a lot of controversy over these last couple of years, and we've seen a lot of the headlines around like even public frustration with denials, with all the obfuscation around like how much we all pay, and I think that the types of user experiences that payers have leveraged will probably change over time. But I think that there is like a really, really great opportunity to sort of create more direct lines with this technology between all those three entities so that at the end of the day, we can be a lot more patient-centered. So I think that's the holy grail. I used to think that was like 5, 10 years away, 10 years away maybe, but it really feels like time machines are broken and that this could happen in the next couple years now.
Thanks. Would anyone else like to weigh in?
Sure, go for it.
I'll say a few words to say that in education, and specifically higher education, the standard adoption curve of early adopters leaning into a new technology is unfolding at Carnegie Mellon and other places where I'm visiting and getting a sense of the rate of innovation. The other thing that I think is happening in terms of disruption is the ability of a university to be a unique or distinctive purveyor of knowledge, to be a place where experts reside, to teach, is becoming more diffuse. And I think folks are recognizing that. So it's beginning to create some existential questions for education.
I think in terms of some of the sectors that I've been looking at, particularly since they're focused on kind of essential industries, a lot of it is similar, I think, to what Shiv was describing in terms of burnout, because a lot of these workers were folks that were, going in person to work, to carry people to work if they're transportation workers, or to serve people in the case of kind of hospitality or food service. And so the question of kind of retention is a really critical one. In transit, the workforce is also aging. I think the average age of a bus driver, for example, is 55. So that's really driving a lot of kind of investment in some of these technologies and thinking critically about the workforce moving forward. Yeah.
So Sarah, just to follow up on that, obviously there's a lot of automation predicted in many of these service sectors that you're studying. How do we ensure that we don't leave these service workers behind, particularly people who are, in the later phases of their vocational career?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, and in my own approach to some of these questions, kind of puts the onus on us as designers and technologists to recognize the value that they do bring to their work, that kind of, and to develop technology that respects that expertise and complements what they bring, rather than kind of thinking that we have an understanding or an abstract understanding of the kind of tasks based on a job description, for example. There's a lot of invisible work done, especially in service sectors, that's under-recognized and traditionally undervalued. So that would be kind of step one, like first principle kind of thing. But I think critically another thing is is thinking about training. So right now, the kind of responsibility for retraining is unclear. So like who takes on that burden? The burden of cost, time, delivering that training is another thing that that is pretty unclear. So right now, I'll just give another example from the transportation sector. Training is highly variable beyond kind of initial licensing. So you may have a vendor that comes in for a day and introduces a new kind of retrofitted technology. And then you kind of have a telephone process after that. So if new workers are brought on, they would get a description from somebody else about how that works. But that's not sustainable if you're thinking about kind of wide-scale change to fleets or things like this, or radically different technologies. And obviously doesn't even touch, I'm talking about operations here or driving the bus, that doesn't even touch maintenance, where we're seeing kind of very radical changes to kind of how fleets will be repaired and maintained over time. And it requires altogether new training. So there's some interesting investments that are being made. Recently, Waymo, for example, introduced a partnership with a community college in New York. But I think we have to think broadly about this as a kind of societal investment. And we think about it at different levels of education, from high school to community college, trade programs, apprenticeships, and university, obviously, which Marissa can talk about. But I think it is something that, in my mind, has come to a head. Like, we have to talk about, like, who, what, when, where of training, retraining specifically, especially for aging populations.
Thank you. All right, I'll go back to maybe a more general topic that some of you touched on in your presentations, but I'd like to dive a little deeper. How are we measuring the impact of Gen AI in each of your domains?
I'd be glad to start on this one. So one of the things that I mentioned is collecting rigorous data. The idea of keeping the same goals in mind of a course or a learning experience and figuring out what are some embedded measures to assess whether those same goals are being achieved with generative AI as without is a standard approach, bearing in mind that learning outcomes are a key goal in our courses, but just asking students, how much did you learn, is not a valid way to measure their actual learning. So really thinking about how we can look at performance measures and really hone in on what students are able to do rather than just their perceptions is one important thing. Layering onto measuring students' actual learning outcomes is measurement and assessment of the distribution of those outcomes to ensure that they're equitable outcomes across all the students in a course. One of the things we think about a lot are equity of access to different tools. Even at a university like CMU, where base tools are provided to our full community, some paid versions and more bells and whistles can be available to a subset of the population. So looking at valid measures of learning outcomes, the equity of those outcomes, and also other measures that we really care about, students' sense of belonging, their feeling included, and does the introduction of generative AI support those, enhance, or impede those outcomes?
Anybody else like to add? Shiv?
Yeah, I think that from the vertical industry perspective, there is a spectrum of sort of approach that one can take. And this is clearly like very biased, but I think that there's like a party trick out there right now that we've all experienced, and it's like wonderful to get that really quick output. Maybe like the best metaphor that I've used in much less technical audiences than this is almost like Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, and like thinking fast was that ChatGPT moment, and now with reasoning and like these more like complicated agentic systems, it's much more thinking slow and figuring out things over time. And if we had the DeepSeek moment, we're sort of in the throes of now the Manus moment. Meanwhile, so many of us are talking about model context protocols from Anthropic, and so there's just so much happening at the same time on this other end of the spectrum, where it's less party trick and a lot more like, I feel like where industry's dialogue has gone very quickly is who can demonstrate reliably, that you can scale and produce a certain outcome, like measurable outcome, very quickly. Like the days for us of being able to delight, a buyer, for example, and very quickly skip steps are long gone, and we're incredibly excited about that. I think folks have realized that you can't use deterministic scorecards to measure probabilistic technologies, and in our space, you might have a really good day or few days or weeks, but you only really know how well a technology is working when you've really pounded it against, in our case, all the different doctors and all the different specialties and all the different settings and in all the different spoken languages. And so for us, measurement is everything from a technical sort of stack perspective around word error rate and medical term recall to how quickly we can do post-training to update a model to actually be better over time, to does the node actually check off all the boxes that the executive buyers are looking to check off, to user experience oriented metrics around burden and burnout that I think I was speaking to earlier. So the challenge for us is to try to simplify that and put that in front of people. And upstream of all of this is that healthcare has done a pretty good job of this, but is that it's so important that we introduce the right kind of friction into generative AI-oriented workflows, like a human in the loop to us is the right kind of friction, but that we not conflate all the different use cases on that one 2x2 I had into one, and then decide that they all require the same level of governance or measurement or rigor, I might even say. I think that some use cases are going to be fine without, and some use cases are going to require a lot. And realizing or recognizing which ones meet, like require what, I think is going to be the big challenge for us to be able to continue to move fast.
I really like those holistic measures. Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps no big surprise, like a lot of the kind of measures that I'm interested in are around kind of labor process. So how are roles shifting? Is there kind of intensification of work or an alleviation of particular burdens of work? And then also questions of productivity and where do those kind of gains, can workers also reap those gains? So if rather than connecting remuneration to perhaps time, on at work or on a task, right? If there are gains in productivity, can the rewards also be kind of come that way as well? So I think it introduces like together new questions around the organization of work that are really interesting that we'll have to think about, over the coming years.
And Marsha, if I could follow up, so just to draw from our experience, we're running a study on digital and AI literacy in a culinary training academy right now. So we see these workers when they're new and they're getting new skills, they're learning them along with their training. How can we bring some of these topics like learning, performance, and then measures of self-efficacy, how can we bring that to the world as everybody embarks on trying to use AI in the workplace?
Yeah, well, I think you raise a good point because a lot of times the consumers are not aware of the best metrics or, are not necessarily critical consumers of some of the data that we may be preparing to share about the strengths and the risks of different interventions and opportunities. So it might come back again to education and broader awareness. What I think is important is to highlight one key distinction, and that is the distinction between how, especially in the education realm where I focus, a learner may be able to perform better with the aid of an AI tool. It's a totally different question whether they have learned more with that AI tool. And this is that question of, is the AI tool supplanting their learning or supporting their learning? So really looking at assessments and being clear with consumers and others that we want to look at performance with the AI tool and also performance in novel situations, perhaps without the AI tool, to make sure that we're not losing opportunities that we really care about.
Great. I wondered if each of you might speculate a little bit on how Gen AI is changing the nature of expertise in the industry that you work in.
Yeah, so I am. I still see patients, and every Thursday night I'm on call. Every weekend, I do 1 weekend a month, and not the last weekend, but the weekend before that, I was on call and seeing patients at McGee Women's Hospital down the street, and for fun, I de-identified like charts that I was consulted on as a cardiologist, but then pushed them into various LLMs, and obviously like, there's like so much art in the prompt. But like just try to get a sense of what they were capable of, and of course they were capable of like incredible output. But what I also recognized was that it sort of takes two hands to clap. Like I needed to go back and forth with it. These models helped expand my thinking and my differentials, and then my point of view on what the right next step was. And I think I was actually a better clinician because of that tool, of this new process, which will now probably like rinse and repeat every time I'm on call. But I couldn't just sort of blind hit it once and expect something that was useful. Now there have been like several studies that have been published over the last like 6 months, especially some that posit that these models are outperforming doctors. But usually when you look in the methodology, at least a couple of them that I've studied in a little bit more depth, I don't think that they necessarily looked into the depth of of the actual clinical scenario, and sort of we're judging on like the next best step as opposed to like the more holistic sort of care pathway. So at least for the foreseeable, to me, these tools are, it's that same refrain that's probably like been repeated on this stage a billion times. Like the future's here, it's just not evenly distributed. And finding a way to now distribute this technology and get it in the hands of everyone out there is going to be the main challenge. For us, I think like the best metaphor for user experience is good air conditioning, where when it's done correctly, you're not even aware of it. You're just comfortable and you're operating at a higher level. Like, we don't really know what top of license means, I think. I'm convinced for most professions right now. Nobody even can imagine what it means. And I think for me as a doctor, I have a feeling of what it means. And it's, I think, paradoxically profound. I think it means what I idealistically think a mid-century physician, family physician did. Like visited you at home, hand on your back, like when you're going through something really, really challenging, and knowing you and your children and your great-grandparents and exactly what that Google Maps to your final destination, health destination should look like, and then can sort of be your ultimate advocate to sort of help you get there. And I think that's sort of the future that feels like it's right now. So I don't know if that answered the
Yeah,
question.
I have a follow-up question, because I've also read a little bit of this, the very mixed literature on expertise in healthcare, and how some say doctors are doing worse with Gen AI because they can't prompt. Yeah. So given on the one hand that we have this prediction that we're going to reach near human performance, and then on the other hand we have the reality of the messy world of healthcare. Any thoughts?
Totally. I think that people, there is a challenge around the UX here of like, how do you make it clear? You know, and less related to LLMs, but my dad, I'm like the ultimate Indian stereotype, was also a cardiologist here in Pittsburgh and retired. But he retired because he couldn't type fast enough. Like, he literally couldn't do that enough. And so when I knew we were gonna we were on the right track was when I demoed for him, and he was like, oh, I'd still be practicing if I had this technology. It's like, okay, like if you can use this, which is hit a button and then hit a button again, then probably a lot of people can use this. And I think that it's the same story for now clinical decision support oriented workflows that we might build, or clinical trial recruitment oriented workflows, or prior authorization oriented workflows. So a lot of these like healthcare industry specific workflows, we just need to make them super, super easy. So if these trials are coming up with the they don't know how to prompt. No. Like we have to make it a little bit easier to understand how these things actually work.
Other thoughts on expertise? Sarah or Marsha?
Yeah. I mean, when I think of, in some ways, expertise is unchanged within particular service sectors, given the kind of high-touch nature of it and the fact that much of the fields that I study are kind of manual or kind of physical work. But at the same time, like where I do see kind of expertise shifting is at the kind of supervisory, kind of middle manager level, where some of these technologies are coming on board more intensely. So things like kind of scheduling and discretion that a supervisor might have had previously to kind of tweak the schedule to fit individual workers' needs, or respond to requests for days off and things like this, are now mediated through kind of AI-driven scheduling platforms. And so it kind of takes away some of the kind of human connection that one would have had with their manager or boss at work. And workers across the industries that I've studied report challenges with that, and a desire for that human connection again, that kind of cooperation and coordination that was previously had. So thinking again about, perhaps like a human in a loop process where it's not just simply kind of automated and then published, but instead kind of thinking about different adaptations that are necessary to ensure well-being and kind of dignity at work, even while benefiting from the kind of speed and readiness of these technologies.
In higher education, I think our job is to create the environment and experiences where learners can develop expertise. So we need to be thinking about expertise in our disciplines in a very important and perhaps new way, to think about what is the future of the discipline so that our degree programs, our curricula can prepare students with the expertise to be effective and have enhanced capabilities in those fields. So I think in terms of higher ed and thinking about expertise, we really need to think about our curricula and what are the goals of our curricula in terms of setting students up to be the experts that the world needs.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
All right, we're going to take some questions from the audience. We have some good ones, and I will start with a question from Marsha.
Sure.
Who do you feel has the responsibility of teaching all of us end users about the role of AI? Is it universities, AI users, or others?
Well, if end users is sort of across society at large, I think it's way more than higher education. And I'll sort of harken back to Sarah's comment that education, training, and awareness is a huge, huge, important goal, but also a huge challenge in this. I think one of the best things that higher education can do in support of preparing the end consumer is to lean into critical thinking skills, being a constructive critic of output coming from these tools is really important. And also, I think a theme that popped up yesterday and that we heard in the opening remarks, it's equally important to prepare students in their learning to learn skills and critical thinking as it is to prepare them to use these tools.
Thanks.
Audience question for Shiv. Please explain how the need of compliance with HIPAA and other healthcare compliance regulations affected the development of your product.
So HIPAA is really something that protects all of us as patients. I shouldn't say consumers, because that's a different kind of agency that we have as a consumer versus what we have as a patient. As a patient, though, what HIPAA gives us the rights to is to sort of protect our own data in terms of like where it goes, who gets to see it, and so it's important to navigate. So it was a lot more relevant to our strategy. So when we first started the company, and we wanted to go to town immediately with data, and we weren't sure exactly how we would aggregate it. Certainly some health systems allowed us access to de-identified data that needs to check off certain boxes in order to be deemed kosher to be to be accessible to a third party like us. But we actually also had like a direct-to-consumer application, and so it was always interesting and like was revelatory for me that we were on like the other side of like the conversation, the HIPAA conversation at that time, in that we were almost like we felt like we were HIPAA, like we were representing the consumer's best interest, in that we gave the consumer all of the agency in the world to decide like who and what saw their data. So now that we're like fully focused on enterprise, B2B, on top-down, that sort of go-to-market motion, HIPAA, it impacts how we store data, compliance boxes against who has access to anything, how long we might store something, when we might purge everything, how we might de-identify any data when we've got permissions to be able to do, for example, post-training. And so it's a new world that we're living in, where I think all of us and the industry is trying to wrap its arms around what this data actually means and what it represents, and so like the ground is shifting a little bit, but we're working it out. I remember when I was a resident at Michigan, the first patient I saw, before I walked in, and I was very like maybe cocky, new resident, I was gonna throw down and like, drop some mics on this patient and teach them all about their condition. But I walk in this room, and University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, a lot of your patients are professors, and she happens to be a professor at the university, and she immediately starts quizzing me on whether or not she had multiple endocrine neoplasia type 2A or 2B. That was like an MCAT question. And I think I responded the right way after like getting on my heels, and was like, let's look it up together and find out. And I think I can like navigate this. And I think the moment that we have right now is interesting in that our industry, the healthcare industry, will have to grapple with is that we all have access to these tools now. And so we're all going to need to like build a different type of relationship, and power and control and agency. All of these things are going to be very like, they're going to, shift a lot. The ground is shifting everywhere. It's exciting to think, to me, like exciting to think about like what care delivery is going to mean in the coming years.
Thank you. I really appreciate your holistic approach to bringing this technology to healthcare. Question for Sarah from the audience. Many of these employment issues might be better resolved with worker investment. How do we ensure AI isn't being forced into work where it isn't necessary?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think part of our interest, Jodi, is in thinking about different forms of governance, whether it be kind of at the company level or kind of negotiation via contracts through kind of labor advocacy organizations like unions. So that'd be something that is kind of more local or regional. But there are also ways that we can think about this more broadly. So our partners in the transportation space are obviously highly concerned about the implications of autonomous vehicle technologies on their industry, not only for kind of how it will change their roles, but also concerns on liability. So if there's an accident or an incident, who bears the brunt of responsibility? And there are some precedents that it would be them, right? If they're kind of like on board and the credentialed are licensed attendant on board. So if they move away from a kind of direct manipulation of the vehicle into kind of a supervisory position, they would still kind of bear the burden of responsibility. So there are a lot of concerns that kind of like challenge their role today and introduce new complexities. So our partners have approached this differently. So one partner has actually, in one particular local, negotiated for veto power over the introduction of technology into fleets, and also negotiated for no replacement or displacement of workers, which is pretty astounding to me that they were able to establish that. But our other partner has actually taken a federal approach, meaning that they've worked with a U.S. representative to craft a bill that would require the highly stringent safety standards for any kind of autonomous vehicle technology that is introduced to public transit vehicles. One would be more of a blanket, and it would kind of run across the whole United States, but take longer. And the other is kind of local by local, so kind of more incremental approach. So I don't think either one is like correct or the only option, but I do think that we can look toward models like this and other kinds of like worker organizing efforts, say the kind of writer's strike and the subsequent contracts that they received out of that 2023 strike, and kind of learn lessons for kind of how different workers are negotiating and introducing kind of autonomy over the implementation of some of these tools. So I think there's a lot to learn from that, essentially. Yeah.
Thank you. So as we wrap up, panelists, I wondered if any of you would like to share some predictions for where AI, which is in such a hype cycle, will be going in the next 1 to 3 years. You can keep it short.
Yeah, I can kick it off. I think that the AI is like at once overhyped and underhyped. And it just depends on who I'm talking to, and then I just try to take the counter view. So I can't tell the pulse of the room, but I think what I can say, like my kids, have you heard of this phenomenon called vibe coding, where you open up like Cursor and you just sort of feel it out and you get to build what you want to build? And I have 8-year-old twin boys who are vibe coding now. Like they did 100 days of like Python and Replit, and now they're in Cursor, and they're like vibe coding websites, web apps that work. And they did this in a matter of like a few months. And now I'm not saying this is production grade code, and like we certainly wouldn't hire these guys, but like, but I think it's like a wild moment that like that this is happening. Like and like human creativity, my most bullish self feels like it's gonna flourish. And then back to that top of license thing, it's like we don't even know what that looks like. I think for all the bears in the room that this is like way overhyped and like, oh my God, we need to like put the brakes on this stuff. Why I think we need to put the gas down, and obviously as an industry person, take all of this with whatever grain of salt you want to put on it. But I think why I think we need to like put the pedal to the metal in the right spots is this. This is feedback from one of our users, Rural Health PCP, and she wrote, I was sitting at dinner last week and my son asked me, Mommy, why aren't you working right now? I literally took my phone out and explained to him that Abridge is a new tool that lets mommy come home early and eat dinner with her family. I started to tear up and looked over at my husband, who then said, Mommy's going to be able to eat dinner with us every night now. So I think that there's so much value that we've got to find a way to like on scale, like honestly, across the country very, very quickly.
Anyone else like to weigh in?
Well, I mean, I think like a lot of technologies, you know, we think about the internet or social media, they are new and salient and a point of focus, and given some UX approaches and advancements, I think a prediction for the future is that this will just, we won't even be thinking about it as much.
Totally.
Because it will just be part of workflows and ways of being. And so it's all the more important to be having these conversations now so that we can bake good processes and responsible behaviors into that future.
Yeah, I think that I love that thought, just thinking about baking it in responsibly. I do think that one thing that I hope for the future, maybe not a prediction, but I hope that there are more kind of industry, kind of academic partnerships that will allow for kind of rethinking of what kind of training and evolving expertise will look like, considering that workflows are rapidly changing and there is immense benefit that could be reaped from this. But knowing how to kind of wrangle that and measure that, I think, is really critical. So I look forward to that.
All right, with that, we're going to wrap this panel. Let's give our panelists a thank you and welcome Hoda back to the stage.
Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful final panel. I am not able to change the slides. Can you move to the next slide, please, for me? Great. So as we conclude this conference, I want to express my gratitude to everyone who made this event a success, our speakers and panelists who are thought leaders in AI governance, and they shared their insights with us. The administrative team behind this event, in particular, I'd like to acknowledge Benedicta Amenio, who worked tirelessly to make this event run smoothly, and all of you, our audience, for your engagement, curiosity, and thoughtful participation. Your presence and contributions have really enriched our discussions and reinforced the importance of the collective efforts in shaping the future of AI governance. We look forward to continuing the dialogue we started here in the future renditions of this conference. With that, I invite everyone to enjoy the networking lunch that's going to be served just outside, and I ask the panelists to stay here for us to take a group picture. Thank you very much, everyone.